Welcome to Echo Forge, dark fantasy and sci-fi stories from the edges of forgotten worlds. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next vision. Now, let's step through the gate.
The explorer was alone, surrounded by the ship's blinking nerve center and the vast, silent dark beyond. A web of sensors and consoles enveloped him, their array of polished dials and buttons awaiting his touch. He moved with precise determination, like a conductor orchestrating machines, the hum of power supplies vibrating around him as he calibrated the instruments to catch the pale light of a nebula far from reach. Green and blue lights played across his face, casting shadows that flickered in tandem with the blinking panels, a pulsating rhythm in the midst of the deep and endless void. He stood before the sensor array, its intricate design mirroring the complex dance of his fingers over controls that seemed both familiar and otherworldly. Each movement was careful and practiced, a testament to the long, solitary weeks spent charting unknown regions of space. His eyes, focused and unblinking, traced every flickering readout on the console. They absorbed and analyzed the streams of data, like a seeker absorbing scripture, while the low hum of machinery buzzed a relentless, constant chant in the background. "Every reading must be precise for the nebula analysis," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though not to disturb the universe's silent expanse pressing in on all sides. His words echoed a personal mantra, as steady as his hands. He double-checked each measurement with a ritualistic devotion, tightening the margins of error until they were as close to nothing as he could manage, while the dimly lit room vibrated with the vessel's steady energy. The explorer's reflection danced in the glossy surfaces of the panels, fragments of his intense concentration shimmering in green and blue. In this lonely cathedral of technology, his every breath and motion were infused with purpose, each adjustment and keystroke like a silent prayer to the gods of data and discovery. The click of buttons and the turning of dials marked the passage of time, an unseen clockwork driving him through the monotonous fight against space's cold embrace. He logged detailed notes into the digital ship's log, his voice unwavering as he recited his observations aloud. The melding of scientific rigor and personal conviction created a symphony of isolation, his dialogue interweaving with the ship's low hum. The words poured out, a steady stream documenting his relentless pursuit, transforming numbers and probabilities into meaning and foresight. Velocity, unchanged; trajectory, holding; resonance, within limits, he intoned, each entry a testament to his single-minded determination. Each precise keystroke was the heartbeat of his mission, punctuating the void with a rhythm known only to him. This was his dialogue with the cosmos, an ongoing conversation where he alone awaited a reply. With every observation, he seemed to define his existence in this empty realm, a solitary figure holding firm against the universe's overwhelming silence. The explorer's meticulous adjustments marked every moment, a practiced routine that captured both his passion and obsession. He moved between consoles with the grace of an artist, the precision of a scientist, every task a brushstroke on the canvas of the unknown. His isolated struggle against the vast emptiness stretched out in front of him like the infinite paths of the stars, ominous and endless. His commitment stood stark against the oppressive solitude, an echo of determination reverberating in the shadowed corners of the ship. As he logged the final data points, a brief flicker, a touch of uncertainty perhaps, glimmered in his eye before vanishing into the green and blue. He stood for a moment, his shadow a dark spectre against the lit panels, a lone silhouette facing the vastness of what lay beyond. Though the hum of the ship never ceased, his breathing slowed, filled the space with something almost like expectation. In this void, where the past and future blurred into endless horizons, his voice, an anchor against the unknown, rose again. "Every reading must be precise," he repeated, more to himself than to the mechanical confines that held him, the words floating into the uncharted distance. He didn't know yet how much those readings would mean, how they'd foretell what waited, but he could feel something shifting in the universe's deep currents. For now, though, there was only him, the lights, and the limitless dark. The ship was quiet, an unyielding silence pressing against every corridor as the explorer finished his sensor review and began his daily regimen. He entered the gym, a cramped space barely containing the sparse equipment and his determination. His breaths, controlled and rhythmic, broke the heavy quiet as he lifted weights with methodical precision, muscles straining under the indifferent fluorescent glare. Each repetition was a defiance of inertia, a reminder of his physical existence in this expanse that threatened to erase him. He moved with the fluidity of practice, the weights a steady rhythm in his hands. Sweat beaded along his forehead, slipping down in glistening trails that marked his effort. The ship's silence seemed to close in, as if waiting for his body to yield, but his measured exhales fought back with unwavering resolve. It was an exercise in more than strength. It was an affirmation of life amid the emptiness, a reminder that he was here, tangible, enduring. "Stay strong," he murmured, almost too quiet to hear above the silent press of the ship. The words hung in the air, half encouragement, half command. He pushed through the series of well-rehearsed exercises, every movement deliberate, every muscle obeying his insistence. The space around him was indifferent, cold metal and distant hum, but he imbued it with intent and purpose, his breath the only warmth in the vast chill. The weight settled with a dull thud as he transitioned seamlessly, a practiced routine moving him from exertion to endurance. He stepped onto the reconditioned treadmill, its old mechanics humming beneath him like a companionless chant. His footfalls echoed softly in the ship's hollow expanse, a measured tempo that carried him through laps and laps of this confined universe. The isolation was complete, but his mind cut through it with focus and clarity, a blade against the shapeless dark. Sweat continued to trickle down his back as he ran, forming rivulets that followed the grooves of his spine. The ship stood silent and watchful, as if waiting for his resolve to break. "Stamina for the long haul," he said, the mantra crisp and efficient, an assertion against fatigue and despair. He drove his legs harder, stretching the limits of the enclosed space, a solitary figure in motion against the vast inertia that surrounded him. Slowing his pace, he stepped off the treadmill and wiped his face, the cloth absorbing both moisture and the relentless solitude. His movements remained brisk and efficient as he left the gym, the narrow corridors stretching like a tunnel through silence. The stillness of the ship seemed thicker now, almost sentient in its omnipresence, as though aware of his exertion and its own immutability. In the compact galley, he assembled a nutrient-dense meal with the same careful intent. The ingredients lay in orderly precision, awaiting his touch. He chopped and stirred with a quiet resolve, his actions mirroring the rigor of his exercises. "Fuel for body and mind," he said, each word precise and practiced, the brief affirmation punctuating the empty space. The ship remained silent, a looming void against his calm industry. His fingers moved with dexterous certainty as he prepared his portable stew, mixing sustenance with the dogged persistence of a man who would not yield. Even the soft clink of metal on metal seemed deliberate, every sound measured against the oppressive quiet. His solitude was complete, a single consciousness surrounded by indifferent mechanisms and an even more indifferent void. As he ate, his determination seemed to thicken the air, every bite a rebellion against isolation. He finished with an air of practiced calm, his gestures deliberate, as if the act of eating were another piece of the ritual that sustained him. The ship watched with unblinking silence, and his lone presence became a shout in its deafening quiet. Leaving the galley, he walked the narrow passageways, each step leading him toward the small sanctuary of his workstation. The ship's unchanged hum was a reminder of constancy, the vessel a cocoon of steel in the vast web of space. Settling into his chair, he initiated a personal log entry, his voice steady as he began to record his reflections. The commitment to mapping uncharted regions filled the spaces between his words, underscoring each sentence with a relentless pursuit. "Day 224, he began, the digital interface glowing dimly as it captured his thoughts. "Progress continues according to plan. Physical and mental regimen holding strong. Sensor review thorough." The words carried his dedication across the silence, his dialogue interweaving with the muted sounds of the ship. Though alone, his voice found an audience in the log's waiting memory, preserving each syllable with electronic precision. He paused, his gaze drifting across the metallic confines, the vast emptiness closing in, but never quite reaching him. Uncharted regions demand complete focus, he said, more to himself than to the machine, the sound of his voice a thread in the vastness. The possibilities, endless. The silence swallowed his last word, but he spoke again, driving back the dark with a final declaration. Commitment. Unwavering. His thoughts lingered, trailing into the quiet as though reaching for something just beyond comprehension. The routine was unbroken, the process unchanged, yet there was a tremor in the cosmos he couldn't yet identify. As he logged the final entry, a hint of expectation hung in the air, a subtle shift in the universe's indifferent watch. The entity was near, though he didn't know it yet, a presence about to fill the silence with something other than emptiness. He leaned back, eyes closed against the glow of the screens, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt the stillness break, the ship's unyielding silence giving way to a soft, insistent pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His thoughts drifted, almost believing that in the cold and dark, something was reaching back. The explorer's thoughts drifted among a sea of stars. Their spectral coordinates glimmered at him from digital projections, patterns upon patterns illuminating the navigation bay with flickering lights. They danced across the polished metal walls, faint and artificial echoes of the universe's expanse. He sat in his cramped workstation, bathed in the uncertain glow, reaching for a lukewarm mug that was no longer there. His fingers curled around empty space. It was right here, he murmured, glancing toward the bare spot beside him. The air seemed to tighten around his words, a stillness that pressed in on him from the edges of the room. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, a ritual of patience, before scanning the shadows that draped the consoles and workstations. The persistent hum of the ship was a quiet comfort, a white noise that underscored the isolation of his vigil. When he stood, his chair squeaked like a distant echo, an intrusion on the otherwise perfect silence. The ship's belly extended before him in a tunnel of shifting shadows, and he paused at the entrance to the corridor. A moment of doubt lingered on his lips. It has to be here somewhere, he said, a soft reassurance to himself. Each step he took down the hallway seemed to stretch, time bending in the way it only did in the solitude of deep space. He stopped and turned, half expecting to see the mug where it didn't belong. Instead, the metallic passageway yawned behind him, its distant recesses vanishing into vague darkness. He shook his head, willing the familiar walls to offer a sign, but they remained obstinately inscrutable. Somewhere, an object clattered against metal, and he flinched at the sudden noise. It was closer than he wanted to admit, an unmooring of sound that left a ripple in its wake. The explorer hesitated, the silence pressing at him more insistently now, a tactile thing that slipped under his skin. The hallway opened up around him as he started forward again, steps more urgent, the shadows just as deep and unfathomable as before. Footsteps trailed his own, or seemed to, the rhythm delicate and insistent. He stopped again, the faint patter like an afterthought, and the absence of sound as telling as the noise itself. His laugh was low and humorless, more exhalation than anything else. Just a quirk of this place, he said, his voice a fragile buffer against the eerie vacuum around him. If he kept speaking, kept listening to himself, he could almost forget the uncomfortable disquiet that coiled at the back of his mind. Almost. He resumed walking, the draft of his movements making the shadows leap at odd angles. By the time he reached the navigation bay again, he found himself oddly grateful for the glow of the monitors, artificial and small as it was. It bled into the cramped space, reminding him of the maps, the data, the mundane calculations he could quantify and understand. He lowered himself back into his chair. The simple act of sitting somehow soothing, and his eyes fell to the screen. Numbers streamed by in orderly procession, starlit trajectories reduced to vectors and arcs, to known and measurable entities. He hesitated before addressing the empty air. So where is that damn mug, then? He tried for levity, but his voice seemed too loud, too alone. The ship responded in whispers, the rustle of some distant movement, the dull thud of something shifted and misplaced. It taunted him with silence more than sound, each interruption brief and disconcerting. As the lights overhead flickered again, he thought he saw a shape, vague, spectral, flit at the edges of his vision. He blinked, but it was already gone, leaving nothing but a chill in its wake. "Right," he said, dragging the word out, filling the quiet. He tapped a series of keys, each click deliberate and grounding. Nothing more than quirks of this place, just being alone too long. The thin metal walls seemed to breathe around him, as if denying his certainty, the ship's pulse a spectral accompaniment to his growing doubt. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the tight space behind him with a wary eye. The coffee mug was still missing. The explorer turned back to the console, hands moving with intention but less precision, like a machine worn down by entropy. "Right," he repeated, and this time it was more forceful, as if daring the shadows to contradict him. The digital readouts provided a soothing counterpoint, a stream of facts that defied the intangible. The entity lingered in disturbances, in light and sound and motion, in everything that defied his tidy narratives. But the explorer chose his own fiction, though it left a trace of chill at the edge of every word. Sleep eluded him, a star in a distant quadrant, receding into endless space. He closed his eyes against the glowing map of his cabin, against the lights that throbbed with memory, not electricity. When he opened them, the confines of his narrow bunk held him like a womb. He let himself drift, his mind unfurling in long spirals of exhaustion and doubt. The explorer lay back on the thin mattress, its familiar discomfort barely registering through the fog of his thoughts. He had spent hours cataloguing, calculating, attempting to restore the predictability of starlight paths and planetary drifts. But the day had been one of strange variables. Objects misplaced, sounds misplaced, his own certainty misplaced. The glow from the instrument panels traced faint patterns over the ceiling, hieroglyphs of data and static that spoke in silent, steady rhythm. He listened to the hum of the ship, an ambient reassurance, even as his mind turned traitorously to the things he could not explain. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered into the dark, the sound of his own voice startling him with its weariness. The small space absorbed his words with indifference. He reached for the edges of rationality, grasping them with the stubbornness of the tired and the solitary. He shifted, pulling a threadbare blanket around him, a futile ward against the chill that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His eyelids grew heavy, and he let himself sink into the soft pressure of sleep, into the hopeful suspension of disbelief. And then the shadows moved. He snapped awake, the world of sleep tearing apart like a thin veil, a flicker, a silhouette at the periphery of sight, the ghost of a ghost. He sat up abruptly, heart quickening, the quiet air pulsing with a presence he could not see, but felt deeply. "Who's there?" His voice was low, and he hated the hesitation it carried, the undertone of doubt that betrayed him. He swung his legs over the side of the bunk, his feet touching the cool floor. The cabin was a cocoon of dark and light, the glow from the instruments painting, shifting landscapes across his vision. The figure, had it been a figure, was gone, absorbed into the recesses of the ship like a trick of light and fatigue. His thoughts raced against the silence, the steady tempo of his pulse loud in the empty room. "Who's there?" he repeated, stronger now, but the reply was nothing more than the whisper of air through the ventilation ducts, the unsettling suggestion of movement just out of sight. He rose, uneasy, and took a tentative step toward the place where the apparition had been. It was gone, he told himself, perhaps never there, and yet he felt the certainty of it slip away like the half-remembered fragments of a dream. Still he searched, opening storage panels and peering into the dark gaps between walls. Each hollow space mocked him with its emptiness, each shadow deepened his doubt. The hours of solitude stretched behind him, and the explorer knew that the real threat was not what he saw, but what he began to believe. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion bleeding into frustration, and sat back on the edge of the bunk. He had let his mind wander too far, had given too much ground to the unexplainable. When he closed his eyes this time, it was with force, a deliberate shutting out of everything but the logical. "I'm losing it," he confessed to no one, his words a faint tremor in the stale air. He lay back down, the ceiling above him a shifting tapestry of phosphorescent glow and spectral doubt. He pulled the blanket tight again, though it offered no comfort. The edges of sleep curled around him, deceptive and insistent. It happened again, this time closer. A presence on the edge of becoming real. The entity loomed in abstraction, each appearance a little bolder, a little more sure of its own existence. It took form in his imagination and in his waking life, and the explorer's determination to dismiss it was the only thing more fragile than his certainty. As he hovered between sleep and wakefulness, a vision more vivid than all the rest flared into view. He refused it with a resolute clench of his jaw, but it lingered there, insistent, until he could no longer deny the urgency of its message. He awoke with the undeniable sense of having been invaded. As his eyes blinked open, the explorer felt it. Subtle, like the echo of a voice through a thin wall, something out of place but not easily grasped. He lay there, listening to the low hum of the ship, feeling it seep through him like an unwelcome draught. In the dimness of his cabin, his eyes moved to the narrow shelf where the family photos sat. It was wrong. They were rearranged, frames askew in a display of madness that clashed with the rigid order he craved. He swung his legs over the bunk and stood on the cold floor, repeating to himself, "This isn't right." His hands, tremulous and unsure, reached out to touch them, to make them his again. The silence around him seemed to amplify his unease. There was something different about the ship's hum today. It droned, invasive, its monotonous thrum resonating with his racing heart, echoing his unrest. It wasn't a comforting, living sound anymore. It was indifferent, relentless, stretching through the confines of his cabin like an invisible web. He strained to listen, to pick out anything abnormal, but the constancy mocked him, fueling the notion that whatever had happened, he was the only one to feel it. His gaze lingered on the shelf. The photos should have offered solace, a tether to Earth and its comforting certainties, but they had been defiled, their positions altered, their order destroyed. Where there had been precision and symmetry, now there was chaos. His daughter's smiling face jostled against a picture of his wife and him, the odd angles making them seem like strangers. His hands twitched involuntarily, resisting his mind's attempt to reassure him, to convince him that it was merely a trick of memory. "This isn't right," he said again, the words hollow in the sterile room. Swinging his feet over the side of the bunk, he felt the cold press of the floor against his skin. He stood shakily, the small movement demanding more effort than it should. He rubbed his eyes, half hoping this disarray was just a remnant of a dream. But the photos remained stubbornly out of place, a tangible reminder of the disturbance he could not name. The explorer reached for them, his hands still quivering, fingertips grazing the slick surface of a frame. It had belonged in the center, this one, his wife's face serenely smiling from a beach on another world, another time. He remembered that time, a time before all the expeditions and the separations, when certainty hadn't seemed a luxury. Now, though, the frame was nudged to the side, half behind a group shot from his old team, as if the memories had conspired to change without him. He thought back to how meticulously he had arranged them, an ordered progression, a narrative of connection and belonging, each photo a sentence in the story he needed to remind himself of. Now, though, it was gibberish, each frame shouting dissonance, insisting that something was profoundly wrong. "It doesn't make sense," he murmured, the words soft but edged with desperation. He adjusted one frame, then another, shifting them into a semblance of their original positions. Even as he touched them, trying to restore order, a part of him shrieked that this was more than simple misplacement. Someone had done this. The ship was sealed. He was alone, wasn't he? He clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to the solid, sensible world, trying to banish the vision of intruding hands rifling through his memories. The silence in the room felt different now, weighted and watchful, each small sound, a faint buzz, the shuffle of his feet, heightening his suspicion. He drew back from the shelf and stood there, taking in the room, trying to catch the subtle shift of reality that signaled he was no longer master of this space. The thin air felt oppressive in his lungs, his breathing came quick and sharp. He turned away from the photos, trying to steady his heart and his thoughts. It had to be his mind, frayed by isolation and stress, conjuring threats where there were none. Yet the rearrangement was so exact in its disorder, too purposeful to be accidental. Maybe he was slipping, losing hold of his grip on reality, creating these patterns in a search for meaning. The thought jabbed at him, a greater fear than any intrusion. He began pacing, the cramped space giving him only a few steps before the wall interrupted. He traced a hand over the cold metal, feeling its solidity, hoping that something so tangible would root him. Was it possible he had done this himself, unaware? His thoughts spiraled, darting between disbelief and a gnawing suspicion that something greater, something vast and unseen, had touched him. Again his eyes went to the shelf, and he could almost imagine the photos moving, shifting under the influence of some insidious presence that watched and waited. But he refused to let them, whoever or whatever it was, win. The sharp clarity of his memory told him that his paranoia wasn't unfounded. He leaned against the wall, head tilted back, surrendering to the momentary respite of its cool touch. Was this how it started? Was this how others had lost their sanity, piece by unnoticed piece? He felt the dread rising again, flooding him with an icy resolve. If something was toying with him, he would not give it the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He'd seen the reports from previous expeditions, the whispers of hallucinations and mysterious phenomena. But he would remain vigilant, methodical, a man of order even in chaos. "It's real," he said, more to the silence than to himself, as if daring it to argue. He would prove it to himself, prove that this wasn't just in his mind. With a steadying breath, he turned to face the room with renewed determination. The photos stayed as he had placed them, silent witnesses to the invisible struggle that had gripped him. "This isn't over," he murmured defiantly, knowing that it had only just begun. His mind clung to that certainty like a raft, a refusal to be swallowed by doubt. He stepped away from the wall and moved towards the cabin door, his body still thrumming with unease, but driven now by the purpose of a man who refused to let the shadows win. The data poured across the screen, glowing green and insistent, as the explorer hunched over the console. His eyes tracked the streams of numbers, but the reassurances they offered felt brittle and insubstantial. "Nothing wrong," they shouted, "everything normal, everything fine," as if daring him to argue. The diagnostics bay was a cage of humming machines, their low chorus twisting with the doubt that gnawed at him. He rubbed his eyes, fatigue pressing at the edges of his focus, demanding attention. Could he trust even this? The data, the technology, the ship? He felt a presence at his back, cold as a spectre's breath, and he turned to see a reflection that stopped his heart. It was there, and then it wasn't. He muttered, "Not possible," and logged the incident, feeling the whole ship had conspired to unnerve him. He was going through the motions of a man possessed, running his fingertips over the keys with quick precision, initiating a full system scan. It had to show something. It must. The sensation that had engulfed him in his cabin, that had sent him here with such urgency, couldn't just be a figment of his exhausted mind. But there it was again, stark in its refusal, all systems normal. No intrusions, no malfunctions, no evidence of the presence that lingered just out of sight. The lines of data scrolled past, uncaring, their constant motion an assault on his already fraught senses. He wanted to believe them, wanted to lose himself in the simplicity of their black and white world. But instead, they only fed his doubts, adding to the sense that everything was conspiring against him, whispering treachery in the guise of truth. He paused to rub his eyes again, the heaviness of sleepless nights catching up with him, the edges of his vision tinged with fatigue and a slow-building desperation. He was alone. The truth of it felt oppressive, the silence of the small room growing larger than him, swallowing him in its indifference. Not even the machine seemed to acknowledge his presence. The bay felt like an extension of the intruder, vast and unfeeling. Then it was there, a shimmer on the edge of perception. The chill of it froze him in place, an icy certainty that he was not alone after all. He turned and saw the impossible, a flash in the corner of the display that shouldn't have been there. The face of his old partner, gone these many years, looked back at him, familiar and haunting. It was a trick of the light, a trick of his mind. His pulse hammered, and he spun to catch it head-on, daring it to be real. "Not possible," he breathed, the words ghosts themselves in the empty room. The image vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a certainty that was worse than doubt. The system's cold reassurance only made it clearer. This was something beyond them, beyond him, and it wouldn't let him rest. He leaned closer, peering into the reflection's now empty space, waiting for it to reappear, for some glitch or hallucination to let him dismiss it. Nothing. Just his own stricken face, pale and stark against the shifting green of the data. He pulled back, forcing himself to be calm, to be logical, to be the man he needed to be against this inexplicable siege. His fingers moved again, logging the incident with the same care he would have shown on any mission. The stark letters were a promise to himself that he wasn't losing it, that the reflection and the rearranged photos were part of the same pattern, something real that he could hold on to. He typed, "Unexplained visual anomaly, sensor display." The mechanical motion of his hands a brief small comfort. But there was nothing small about what he felt. He took a deep breath, trying to sort his thoughts, trying to impose order on the chaos inside him. What if he was unraveling? The logs would help him piece it together later, if this was only the beginning. He couldn't let it be the beginning. He had to trust himself, had to trust that this was external, an intrusion, and not some failure of his mind. The ship's relentless hum taunted him, vibrating in his bones. He entered a second record, this one more personal. His fingers trembled on the keys, but the action steadied him. He couldn't let the official records be his only witness. He needed his own account to prove to himself later that this was happening, that he hadn't imagined the nightmare of the past day. He stared at the screen, his reflection rippling through the lines of data like a figure caught between worlds. The name of his old partner haunted him, insistent as memory, but he pushed it away, filing it with the rest of the incident. A part of him feared opening that door, letting the past spill out into the fragile present. But another part clung to it, hoping it might lead to answers. Leaning back, he tried to force a sense of normalcy onto the situation, tried to tell himself that the reality he trusted still held some weight. A few changes to his routine, and maybe he could regain the footing that felt so perilously lost. He typed out adjustments, his sleep schedule, his supplements, each a talisman against the irrational. He was not one to be defeated. The surreal happenings gnawed at him, chewed at his resolve, but his stubbornness held strong. If the world turned sideways, he'd be the man standing upright, defying gravity itself. He logged out of the console and rose from his seat, feeling the weight of his decisions settle on his shoulders, a small but meaningful armor against the unknown. For a moment he stood in the bay's doorway, surveying the room as if it might yield some secret if he stared hard enough. The low hum of the ship pressed in, an ever-present force that felt almost sentient in its persistence, alive with menace. The thin strip of lights above flickered for the briefest instant, then stabilized in a harsh glow that sent the shadows skittering back to their corners. "Not yet," he whispered into the silence, a vow and a challenge. He shut the diagnostics bay behind him, and the click of the door was like the start of a countdown he couldn't quite hear, couldn't quite escape.
Thanks for watching Echo Forge. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so the next tale finds you. Share this with someone who loves dark fantasy or twisted sci-fi, and I'll see you in the next world.